the event. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this ETUI FEPS double webinar on responses to COVID. My name is Sotiria Theodoropoulou. I'm head of Unit of European Economic, Employment and Social Policies at the European Trade Union Institute in Brussels. And I will be chairing the first of the two webinars, which will be discussing an assessment of the recovery plan that was proposed for Europe last week by the European Commission. Before we begin, I would like to give you a few technical instructions. We have 1 hour for our discussion, and the way we propose to structure this is that we're going to have 3 rounds of questions to our speakers. And then, if time permits, we will also choose 1 or 2 questions from the audience. So please do use the questions function of Zoom to submit your questions if you would like to ask anything. The other thing that I would like you to know is that if you would like to tweet about the webinar, we suggest that you use the hashtag #NextGenerationEU as one word. I would also like to inform you that the event will be live streamed on Facebook via the ETUI page and shared by FEPS for this part of the webinar, and the FEPS page and shared by the ETUI for the next webinar, which will start at 1 o'clock. So as I mentioned, today we're going to, in this first webinar, we're going to have a first assessment of the recovery plan for Europe that was suggested last week. This has been a widely awaited proposal. European member states have been facing many important challenges even prior to the pandemic, namely an effective response to climate change, a just transition to net zero carbon and digitalized socioeconomic model, and also the need to tackle the wide economic, social and labor market inequalities that we have been observing in Europe. This pandemic is creating is creating a context that further makes dealing with these prior challenges even more difficult, not least because the response for protecting public health and healthcare systems from collapsing is leading EU economies to a recession which is going to be very deep and whose duration we cannot even forecast at the moment, as it depends on developments on the epidemiological and medical front. These challenges have been present in all member states. However, it is fair to say that they have not been present to the same extent, and the capacity of governments to respond to these challenges has not been the same across member states. In that sense, the current situation has also been presenting an opportunity to Europe to present a response that would show more solidarity across member states. And last week's proposal for the recovery plan was meant to be a step in that direction. So today we're going to take a first stab into assessing whether this proposal is indeed a step in that direction. And of course, given that the European Commission proposal will eventually have to be approved unanimously by member states, what are the possible challenges lying ahead at the political level for getting an agreement? We are very pleased to have with us today 3 distinguished speakers to discuss the recovery plan. Agnès Bénassy-Quéré, who is a professor at the Université de Paris 1, Panthéon, Sorbonne. She's a professor of economics. Peter Bofinger, who has been a professor at the University of Wuerzburg, and Paul Magnette, the leader of the Parti Socialiste in Belgium, who will join us around 12:15. Without further delay, I will start then with the first questions to our our 2 panelists for the moment. So, Agnès Bénassy-Quéré and Peter Bofinger, do you think that the recovery plan proposes adequate tools for addressing the challenges lying ahead for Europe? Most notably, the need to recover and reconstruct the European economies after the pandemic while promoting a just transition to a net zero carbon economic model with lower inequalities. And if so, why or why not? And what are its strengths and weaknesses?
Shall I start?
Okay, shall I start? Yeah.
Agnès, go ahead.
Thank you. So thanks for the invitation. I think this is a very important moment, at least in terms of the intention. This is a very important piece the Commission has put on the table. We know there is a lot of money in it, 750 billion. Even if you restrict this to grants, it's a mixture of grants and loans, it's sizable. It's not huge, but it's really sizable. It's temporary in terms of spending, and the borrowing, there is a borrowing on the market, which is to be repaid over a long period. So I would see three main strengths and three main weaknesses of the proposal. In terms of strengths, I think first the size. It's so as I said, if you restrict to grants, it's about, and you spread over 3 years, it's about 1% of GDP every year. So it is sizable. The second strength, repayment is planned over a very long period, not before starting not before 2028. And this is important also because of the loans. So it makes the loans much more attractive for the member states. And the third strength, in my view, is the intention to rely on own resources, although it's going to be a big battle, and especially on carbon-related own resources, which would align the incentives of the governments with the transition, the green transition, because if they want more resources to repay the loans, then they need to be to have a higher price, carbon price. So this is very good. On the side of the weaknesses, and then I will let it to Peter to give his views. I see also three weaknesses. The first one is that we again have the juste retour problem. The Commission has published a table where you can see the contribution of each country and what it would reap from the new programs. So there's going to be a battle on this juste retour issue, and so the funds are pre-allocated per country, which is a bit awkward in my view, especially when you have a common objective, which is the green transition. The second weakness is that there is not much before 2021. There's 11 point something billion out of the present MFF. But most of the spending is delayed, and in terms, so there's a big question about the implementation. So the intention is to be counter-cyclical, but in fact, it's not so sure that it will arrive at the right time to be counter-cyclical. And if it's allocation spending, then why should it be temporary? So this is a big question, a kind of contradiction. And the third weakness, in my view, is, well, it's good to rely on a European semester rather than on conditionality. European semester is something that everybody needs to agree with. However, the European semester so far has been quite weak. So you put a big budget relying on something that is weak, especially the macro imbalances procedure, which is, in my view, not well designed, and there will be an issue about reconvergence of the economies in the recovery phase of the crisis.
Thank you very much, Agnès Bénassy-Quéré, also for sticking to the time. Peter Bofinger, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. I have very little to add what Agnès said. So I would phrase the whole recovery fund as a paradigm change, but not as a game changer. And paradigm change is obviously due to the fact that now the EU is raising its own debt on the capital markets. It's not national debt. And of course, what matters is that the funds are distributed as grants, at least 500 billion euros, and not as loans. And I think compared to the Eurogroup proposals and decisions in early April, this is a fundamental change. And of course, this change matters for countries like Italy that are highly indebted, and for which additional loans are not really that relevant. Of course, it helps to reduce the interest rate burden, but overall, it's not what these countries need. So I think we have this paradigm change, and I think that's very, very important. But I don't think it's a game changer. And what do I mean with this? So if you look at the problems that especially the countries in Southern Europe are facing right now, is of course that due to the economic crisis, their debt levels will go up, and they will go up considerably, and they will raise levels of 160% and more in the case of Italy. And I think this is, in my view, the most fundamental problem these countries are facing. And for this problem, the Recovery Fund does not provide a major improvement, maybe 1 or 2 or 3% debt to GDP less, but overall the debt issue remains, and I think this is something that will make the Eurozone more fragile. I think if after the pandemic is over, financial markets will see the huge debt problems of Italy and other European countries. And I think what really is needed is, of course, a kind of really a strong and effective fiscal capacity for the euro area. And I think that's what is really needed to overcome the crisis in an effective way. And I think this is still lacking. And you can see it if you look at the data, how much the countries are really using to stabilize the economies. There are calculations by the IMF, and they show the United States has an impact of about more than 10% of GDP of the measures that are relevant for the budget, while in the euro area you have about 3%. I think Italy is 1%. So you can see right now that the countries in Southern Europe are not able to react to the crisis in an adequate way because they see the problem of debt. And I think this is, in my view, the most threatening challenge that we are facing. And for this, this recovery fund is not really the solution. So, yeah, it's important that we have it. It's an important step, and it's this paradigm change. But if you ask what are the most challenging problems of the countries, especially in Southern Europe, it helps a little bit, but it's not really the game changer that is needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter Bofinger. I should probably move on to the second question. I'm not sure whether Paul Magnette has yet joined.
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay, welcome. Yeah, Paul Magnette, the leader of the Parti Socialiste in Belgium. Thank you for joining us today. I'm not sure whether, given that you joined a little bit earlier, you would also like to give your views on whether you think that the proposal of the Commission last week proposes adequate tools for the challenges lying ahead for the European member states, or whether we should move on to the second question. We should move on to the second question.
As you like, as you like.
We have a few minutes, so if you would like to say something briefly on the first question, you would be most welcome. I would say
certainly not very, what I could say about it is certainly not very original, but I think we should welcome this initiative, because it's better than nothing first, and it's an important political signal also. So yes, of course, it will not be enough, but if the European Commission puts on the table a proposal to go to the market and make as much money as possible available for the member states, which need it not just as loans, but also as direct subsidies on the one hand, and that they argue on the other hand that the only midterm solution is to enhance and to strengthen the EU's own resources via subjects that have been discussed the last 10, sometimes the last 20 years, like the carbon tax at the borders, like the GAFA tax, like the tax on transnational financial transactions, the tax on and the work which is being done in the EU, but also in the OECD, on the harmonization of the taxes on the companies' benefits. Well, this is for the first time. I mean, we've been waiting for this for years. So for the first time, this is not just a point that we as Social Democrats put in the discussion, but it is becoming the official position of the European Commission. It puts a lot of pressure on some member states which were and which remain very reluctant, such as Austria, Netherlands. I mean, we all know them. It's also important in terms of dynamics within the Social Democratic family, because as one of the leaders, I was very sad to take part in discussions where we had Spain and Portugal on the one side of the table and Sweden and Denmark on the other side of the table with completely different visions of what should be done. So I think it's a very important first step that should be supported. We only hope that this will slowly convince everybody that that this should not just be a one shot, or just be an operation which is made in very specific and very exceptional circumstances, but the fact that the EU makes more money available beside its multi-annual financial frameworks for the member states, and to support investments, and to support the financing of a much more ambitious and rapid and fast Green Deal, is something which is a good signal. But we should keep saying that this is not enough. I agree with Peter Bofinger. Sorry, Peter, I only heard the end of your intervention, so I cannot be sure that I agree with everything you said, but at least with the conclusion. But I would say that we should not be, we should be on the side of those who support it, while saying that this is the first step, and we keep fighting for the rest of our proposals.
Thank you. So second question to all three of you. Which are, in your opinion, the trade-offs along which negotiations of the final shape of the program will take place? And yeah. We could start with you, Paul Magnette.
I'm not sure I've understood the question. Trade-offs?
The trade-offs along which the negotiations over the proposal of the Commission are going to take place. What do you think the different axes of issues we will have to have an agreement, we will have to negotiate over to get an agreement, unanimity across member states will be?
Well, I would say that to a wide extent, the proposal of the European Commission is already a trade-off in itself. I mean, it's already a compromise between the visions of the much more ambitious member states, such as Spain and Portugal, of the very ambitious political families, such as ours, and the one who are much less enthusiastic, like those famous frugal countries, and well, Denmark, Sweden, Austria, the Netherlands. So it's already a trade-off when you say it's a mix of loans and subsidies, when you say it's not a, I mean, it would have to be refinanced and reimbursed at some point. It will not be a structural policy, but a one-shot related to Corona. It's already a trade-off, and we should not say, well, on basis of the compromise of the European Commission, we should accept more compromise in direction of those countries which are very reluctant. On the contrary, we should keep fighting for more than this. We should say, well, this is okay, but this is not enough, and not being prepared to make trade-offs that would be even weaker than these proposals. This is in terms of political positioning in general. Then I think we should also keep fighting for the Green Deal, because now critics seems to be less violent than a few weeks ago, but there was a moment at the beginning of the Corona crisis when many member states and many vested interests said, well, given the fact that we would need money to face the Corona crisis, we won't have money for the Green Deal anymore. Sorry about that. So we managed to avoid that kind of argumentation, and already the position of the European Commission is also that besides the Next Generation Fund, we need to strengthen the Green Deal. This is also, of course, a message that we need to support and make it a positive trade-off. We should also keep saying that the MFF is much too limited in scope and in available funds for the next years, and we should keep fighting for a more ambitious MFF than the one which is put on the table by Charles Michel. So let's stress, I think, certainly the Green Deal is the center of the thing, because the Green Deal can be the good articulation between the short-term support that we need, which is absolutely crucial for a number of member states and sectors in our economies and societies, and the long-term objectives, which needs to be much more ambitious. The Green Deal is somewhere in between those two kinds of initiatives. But if we manage to make it the new flagship of the EU, and also the basis of the relationship with the other regions of the world, when we speak of trade, for example, and when we speak of border carbon tax, this would make comprehensive and quite positive agreement possible around the idea that the Green Deal is the next step, but not the last step of the process, and the proposal of the European Commission goes in the right direction, but should certainly not be weakened.
Thank you. Agnès Bénassy-Quéré, would you like to go next, please?
Yes, thanks. So in terms of trade-off, there are three possible directions. The most likely is a fight on the so-called rebates, which is not the best thing you can expect. When we go into this direction, we should always keep in mind that the cost of non-Europe is very large and unequal itself. So when we talk about the resistance, the frugal or whatever countries, these are small open economies. These are countries that reap the highest benefits from EU integration in terms of GDP, from the EU integration, yes. So we should keep this in mind. Some kind of asymmetry in the funding can be justified on these grounds. Now, I think two other possibilities would be much more convincing to me. One is to work on a sector approach of the recovery. We know that there are massive industrial challenges, both in positive terms, in terms of the digital economy, and the so-called frugal four are well placed in this digital economy, so they could benefit from this recovery plan. And we have some negatives. We have a legacy of the old brown economy and with stranded assets and things like that. And so countries have also an equal preference in terms of the speed of the greening of the economy. So this is something that could maybe help overcome the disagreements. And then there is another way to maybe overcome some resistance, is to work on the conditionality. It's not the conditionality by itself, it's a European semester, and it would be the equation to redraft the European semester in a way that is more consistent with some convergence, notion of convergence. We know that today, the European semester produces recommendations per country, country by country basis, and also a recommendation to the euro area. And the recommendation to the euro area doesn't quote any specific country, and it's not much about convergence. A little bit about convergence, like countries in surplus should reduce the surplus, countries in deficit should reduce the deficit, but it's not very specific. And if you dig into the different text, it's sometimes quite inconsistent. We have a massive common good, which is to avoid deflation. And I see a risk of a race to the bottom, which with each country trying to reap some competitiveness advantage, and you would end up with deflation everywhere, a strong euro, which is not the thing you need. So we could maybe, with some coordination with the productivity councils, with the European semester, the MIP, design something that is more consistent with a way out of the crisis without deflation. And I think there's a big challenge there.
Thank you. Peter Bofinger?
Yeah, 2 points. First, as Paul said, I think it's already a compromise, and I think the amount of money that is provided in the form of grants is lower than in the Merkel-Macron proposal, so there is obviously a compromise element already in it. And I think it's a very important point raised by Agnès, is how to streamline and to improve the European semester, because right now, if you look at it, it's hundreds of individual measures, and what really lacks in this European semester is a kind of aggregate approach. And in terms of supply side policies, but also in terms of aggregate demand, I think this would be a good opportunity to streamline this European semester in a way that it really becomes effective. And that's maybe something also the Frugal Four would like as a step forward, so that you get some kind of conditionality, but the right form of conditionality, which helps to bring the European economy, the euro area economy, through this very difficult period now that we are facing.
Thank you. My third question to you: are we likely to see the plan or a compromise that is not too distant from what was proposed last week being approved? If so, under what conditions would you think? What would it take to convince the Frugal Four, among others, the so-called Frugal Four, to join forces in such an ambitious plan?
I think Agnès already said this. I think the Frugal Four are very open economies, and I think they would suffer more from most from European disintegration. I think that's something one should tell them. So if you have a weak Europe, if you have a weak euro area, I think small countries will suffer most from that. I think large economies like Germany or France, maybe they're still able to preserve and to defend their interests on this global scale. But the small Frugal Four, I think it's very naive from them to believe that they can survive with a weak Europe and a weak euro area.
Maybe we can add the fact that since there are small open economies living on trade, on interactions with other countries, more emphasis on cross-border infrastructure and on the openness of the EU as a whole would maybe something that could be of interest to them. Also, the safeguards to the single market. Because we know that today the single market, so there has been a lot of cry against Germany because of the policy of national champions, also against France. And maybe this is also, if the recovery plan could help re-leveling the playing field between European countries, this would be certainly something that would attract the Frugal Four back to the table.
Okay, Paul Magnette.
Well, if I were kidding, I would say if the Dutch still want to go on holiday in Spain and Italy, they should help those countries, because probably the people who go most to those countries on holiday, be it for a city trip or for long time holidays. But more seriously, I think what has made this discussion very politically sensitive in those countries is the fact that everybody assumes at that stage that the money that we borrow today will have to be reimbursed at some point. And that when it will be refunded or reimbursed, this will be based on the keys of distribution that exist today in the EU, which means that the richest country will have to pay more. This is the assumption. If we were, as has been proposed by many different voices, and notably by Spain, in a system where this money does not necessarily needs to be reimbursed. I mean, it becomes a permanent debt of the EU. I mean, it's the EU which borrows money on the market at a very low interest rates. It can be a sort of permanent debt that is permanently refunded, like the sovereign debts of the member states. Then you skip. Of course, it becomes another conceptual change and shift, which is maybe more difficult for countries like Germany in this case. But I mean, as long as those governments have to face arguments from the opposition in the member states, which says, if you accept this plan, this means that Dutch citizens and Dutch taxpayers will have to pay for those Spanish guys, even if it's in 5, 10 or 20 years, it will remain very difficult. If we accepted the idea that the EU as an EU, as a federal system, borrows money on international markets and creates some debt to support not just the countries who need support today in this crisis, but to support the long-term investments and to support the transition of our economy, then it completely changes the nature of, I mean, there is no distributional challenge anymore in this case, and it completely changes the nature of the discussion. But it's the fact that we've framed it in this idea of it's a temporary budget that will have to be refunded at some point, to come back to the idea that the EU doesn't have a debt, which makes this distributional discussion so sensitive. You just get rid of it, and then you've solved the problem and make everybody happy with the idea that the EU can have its own debt.
I think in this regard, I think the Spanish proposal might be helpful to issue this debt as a kind of perpetual bond. I think that could be still a possibility, and I think the markets would buy it, and then the question who has to pay it back is no longer there.
I would tend to disagree on this particular point of perpetual bonds, because it has been shown that the demand for perpetual bond would not be so high, and the interest rate would probably be relatively high. So the idea of issuing long-term debt that can be rolled over, I think, is enough for the purpose. And I agree that this debt doesn't need to be repaid. And you could even push one step further and say that common debt is a public good in some way. So this is kind of contradictory. It could appear contradictory, but it's a public good in the sense that it will stabilize the financial system. It will help the ECB to play its role fully. So having a common debt actually is a very good thing for the EU as a whole, and especially the euro area. So you could say that this is the time to produce this common good because interest rate is zero. So this is exactly the good time to produce this stabilizing financial product.
I think in economic terms, I agree with you, but in psychological terms, I think the perpetual bond would maybe sell better in the political debate, even if it costs a little bit more. No? Maybe.
Well, if I may add an example from Belgium, in Belgium we have a very high public debt, as you know, which is close to 105% now, and we probably go to 125 or 30% after the Corona crisis. But very often we politicians tell the citizens, well, yes, we have a high debt, but we own it. It's your debt. So I mean, you together, Belgian citizens, do own this this debt that we made together for the welfare of the people, and let's be proud of it. So as long as it remains a European debt, which is owned by the EU as such, it is also something which creates a common, something that we have in common. So at least let's have this in common.
So I'm not sure this is convinced the frugal four.
No.
What we have in common is debt.
We will see. I would now like to move on to some questions from our audiences. So I would start with a question by Martin Schmalzfried. It would seem that the debt level is less of an issue than the fact that it won't be serviceable. In order to pay for debt, you need growth. However, many economists are currently predicting an L-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped one, which means that consumption and demand will settle more or less permanently at a lower level. Injecting more money will not necessarily help. What would you recommend in this kind of situation, in the case of an L-shaped recovery rather than a V-shaped one?
So first of all, I'm less pessimistic. I think that in 2021 probably there will be a vaccine, and then the question we need to ask ourselves, in a world that where people can be vaccinated, what will be changed in terms of the economy? So there will be a legacy in terms of debt overhang in the private sector, in the public sector, for sure. But in terms of activity, the business model of firms, where do you see pockets of business that will be affected for a long time? Probably the airlines, probably so the aircraft industry, but the rest is mostly driven by the green transition, actually. So I think next year we will think about the future in terms of the transition, no longer in terms of the crisis itself, except for the legacy. So I'm going to now to answer to your question. What if growth is low, and actually before the COVID crisis it was already too low, and inflation was also too low. Hence my previous point about convergence, which is I think very important. Then we have to look at history. How did the different countries got rid of their debt? So if growth is very low, nominal growth is very low, then interest rates are going to stay very low also. Then the question will be, how can you design? So we know that in the 50s there was a financial repression where the interest rate was lower than nominal growth. How can you how can you get this kind of result in an open financial system today, where people can go to other countries to get higher return? So this will be a big question, and there will be a question of course about taxation. after the crisis, which also will require some coordination. If the economy doesn't recover, then there is no need for the central bank to offload its balance sheet, to reduce the size of its balance sheet. So in a sense, we are safe because there's only one instance where we would be really in trouble, which would be stagflation. So low growth, high inflation. So in that case, the ECB would like to reduce its balance sheet while there will be no growth, hence the debt to GDP ratio would be on the upside. Will go up and probably be non-sustainable. So then the question remains, which is a weakness of the euro area, which is that we don't know how to carry out a debt restructuring within the euro area, given the fact that the banks have a lot of these debts in their balance sheets.
Yeah, maybe 2 points. First of all, I think there's always the possibility to stimulate growth by more investment. And as Agnès said, I think a lot of investment that is needed after the Corona crisis is investment related to green deals, to the energy transformation. And I think in the housing sector, you have huge potential for energy efficient investments. I think all over Europe, and so you can employ hundreds and thousands of people in making the whole housing stock more energy efficient. I think that would be a very important tool to stimulate demand in the post-Corona area. As far as the debt levels are concerned, I think what we need to do is to discuss and to reconsider the whole fiscal framework for the euro area, especially the 60% reference value for debt. I think compared to the 60% reference value, of course, the debt of almost all euro area member states will look very high and maybe look too high. But we also have to be aware that the 60% reference value is a completely arbitrary value. And if you look around to the rest of the world, to the UK, to the United States, to Japan or to China, debt levels are much higher. And I think so we have to rediscuss this and to ask what are sensible target values, sensible anchors for debt to GDP ratios that are really relevant and not just this completely arbitrary 60% reference value. I think we need this discussion because otherwise the debt levels look too high. One night they can always lead to a crisis of confidence on the capital markets. I think this is something that it really needs to be done to reconsider the whole fiscal policy framework for the euro area.
Magnette, would you like to add something to?
Well, I would say that after the very sophisticated answers of Agnès and Peter, I have nothing to add.
Okay.
Maybe I would like to add something on the Stability and Growth Pact, if I may.
Yes, sure.
I agree with Peter that you cannot obviously keep the 60% debt to GDP ratio as a reference. And it's not operational. We will be so far away from it. It doesn't make sense. I think even stabilizing the debt will be a challenge already. And maybe doing a transition of a couple of years, the focus should be rather on liquidity, hence on the gross financial needs, which is the sum of the deficit and of the maturing debts, so the needs in terms of rollover of the debt, in order to keep it on track, like the IMF has done for a long time. I think this will be already quite challenging. And then there were ideas before the COVID crisis, there were ideas about moving to a spending rule, which is more resilient and more friendly both to a progressive reduction of the debt to GDP ratio over a very long time, and countercyclical policies, both in the upside and in the downside. And maybe these ideas should come back, but only after the spending has stabilized in a way, because today we have no idea where the spending is going. Every day there is a new spending, a new announcement of spending. So we need to stabilize somewhat and then come back to maybe thinking about the spending to GDP and long-term standard for spending to GDP.
Thank you. We have a few questions regarding changes in the European semester. I will present them all three to you. One comes from Jonathan Zeitlin. You have spoken about strengthening the European semester. What would such a strengthening look like? Might it look like in practical terms, beyond perhaps reinforcing the recommendation to specific member states within the euro area recommendation? Should, for example, the Commission's assessment of the country-specific recommendation implementation be a criterion for access by member states to grant funds? And if that were to happen, wouldn't there be a danger of reintroducing conditionality by the back door? That's one of the questions we have received on the semester. The other is whether we should be putting a lot of more focus on the need to democratize the European semester process, which at the moment Xavier Dutrény, who posed the question, thinks it's too much of a centralized process. Where the territorial dimension is still too much overlooked. Civil society and trade unions are not much involved. If so, how can we lead this battle? And one final question from an anonymous attendee regarding the European semester as well. Whether the progressive should be more courageous in demanding a non-macroeconomic conditionality for the use of the plan. The Green Deal, fighting inequalities, inclusion, strategic participation of workers in industry, public services, universality, and quality. Okay, who would like to go first?
So there could be a whole webinar on this. These are very, very good questions. I think that the idea of having a carrot related to the European semester is a good idea, because the European semester concerns all countries. So all countries receive country-specific recommendations. It's not just the deficit countries, the usual suspects, it's everybody. And the track record in terms of implementing the reform is not better in northern countries than in southern countries. So there's a symmetry in using the European semester. So this is a good point. What is less good is the fact that the European semester mixes up structural things like reshuffling the education system in a country and short-term things like tax policy or minimum wage or things like that. And we should distinguish the two. There is an objective in terms of long term, and then you need to have a window where the reforms are implemented step by step. And then there is a short to medium term issue, which is the instruments that you can activate at the margin, like the minimum wage, like the tax rates. And here, there is, as I said, there needs to be a view in terms of convergence, not just a country by country. So it's very much country by country. And on the top of that, it disregards a very important element of the short-term and the medium-term imbalances, which is the macroprudential instruments, which are activated by independent institutions with the ECB overseeing the whole process. So I think with the same tools, we can do much better. So this would be my view on the European semester. And then I think another element will have to be, and this moves me to democracy and equality and inequalities. There needs to be a discussion on tax coordination across the member states for different reasons. One is to plug the holes that still remain in the tax basis. And the second one is for mobile bases. We know that it's very difficult to tax the rich. And today, if you look at tax schedules, for instance, in Eastern European countries, you have Eastern European countries with flat taxes. And if you look at the after tax, the disposable income per capita in the different deciles of the population, you see that rich people in some Eastern European countries are much richer than say the third decile of the Italians. So there is no, so I think at some point politically it's going to be difficult to continue to channel transfers from west to east without the east also asking the domestic rich to contribute more. You see what I mean? So this discussion has never come in the EU. It's a kind of taboo. When we talk about tax coordination, we talk about the corporate income tax, the VAT. These are very important issues. And I think there is more than 1% of GDP to reap for better coordination on this, which is sizable, really sizable. But on the top of that, the inequality thing, I think, so if you see that, and if we look at the recovery plans, the key of the spending is not related to those countries that have been hit mostly by the crisis. It's related to GDP per capita. So again, the same kind of criteria as for structural funds. So I think we will not escape a discussion on the tax schedules for personal income taxes and also the evaporation, the fact that we no longer have any wealth tax, except with a few exceptions in the EU.
Peter Bofinger?
Yeah, I think as far as the country-specific recommendations are concerned, I think the most important improvement would be to strengthen the aggregate approach instead of the country-by-country approach. I think it's very useful to go through the needs for each country, but you have to take into account what that means for the aggregate policy stance. And I think Agnès already said it. I think the risk right now is if each country tries to reduce wages and costs and social security contributions, to get a kind of downward spiral, which leads to deflation. I think this aggregate approach needs to be strengthened. Also, in terms of fiscal policy, where it's really important to identify the aggregate fiscal policy stance that is required in the euro area, and to ask what can each country contribute to achieving this fiscal policy stance. And I think this is also absent so far in the country-specific recommendations.
Magnette?
Oh yeah, I think strengthening the semester is important, but broadening the scope of the semester is also very, very important. And my reference remains here the report on sustainable equality that was elaborated by a set of politicians and academics and published in 2018 under the supervision of Luca Cazzelli and Paul Rasmussen. It's a very, very good report. For those of you who haven't read it yet, I really recommend it, because we worked very hard on the semester as it works today, on this asymmetry on the one hand of all these economic issues which are dealt with in the framework of the semester, while the social issues remain the object of a very vague and soft coordination under the Lisbon process or open method of coordination. So the idea was really to have a semester which is focused, which does have indicators which must be strong enough and targets which must be as strong in terms of fighting inequality, reducing poverty, access to housing, that kind of things, and not just the broad economic policy targets. It should also, of course, include all the green transition elements. I mean, if you want to be credible in terms of the Green Deal and to be the world champions of the defenders of the Paris Agreement and the pleas that we made at that moment 5 years ago, we have to have in this framework, of course, there already are some elements for renewable energy, for example, or the reduction of energy consumption. The mechanisms do already exist. But if we have a broader agenda where we would look at the economic, ecological and social dimension of this coordination of the national policies in a process which needs to be, which will be quite heavy process, but which makes sure that when the member states coordinate the policy, it's not just economic and we keep doing lots of competition on other issues, but we have a broad scope and a broad agenda and a strong process of coordination. And the proposal, which is in the Katzelli Rasmussen report, is a very sophisticated one with the timeline, the process of, we thought of all the details, and it would be great if we could come back in the political discussion again. I also agree, of course, with Agnès that the tax coordination is absolutely crucial. I mean, you cannot start building real solidarity and coordination of social and economic policy as long as we have such mechanisms of fiscal competition and even fiscal dumping within the EU, which destroys any kind of also of confidence between the member states and willingness to work together. When you see that the big companies which make huge profits in your country then don't pay anything because they pretend to pay it in other member states where there is virtually no tax. I mean, it creates lots of tensions between those member states, and that's obvious and natural. And I also think that it was a question raised by one of the participants that you mentioned. The issue of democratization is very, very important there. And I would not reduce democratization to the role of the EP. With all the respect that I have for the EP, I think we need a true three-bands process. On the one hand, of course, the EP has to play its role as the only directly elected parliament at the scope of the EU as such. But I was very skeptical initially, but I now defend the idea of Thomas Piketty and others of having a mixed assembly precisely for the supervision of the semester. The problem is very often, and I see that as a national politician, that the national MPs do not really know what's going on at the EU when we have this coordination of European policies. And then when it comes back in the national arena, they can use either say, well, we were not aware of this, or use the EU as a scapegoat and it doesn't help. So having a place where maybe only twice a year for 2 days, national MPs and MEPs, a delegation of MEPs meet and discuss the broad orientations of the European semester, I think would be something which would be much more transparent than the reports of the Council and the European Council, and create some public discussion and also some appropriation by the member states, by the national politicians of those very crucial European issues. And the third band, of course, is the social dialogue. I mean, it was so obvious at the time of Jacques Delors. We could not think of anything in the EU, the Charter of Social Rights, the European social conventions, and that kind of things needed to be discussed and even negotiated by the social partners at the European level. It's kind of disappeared. But it should become, I mean, in most member states, certainly in Belgium, Germany, I mean, the Nordic countries, this is seen as industrial democracy and as a complement to the political democracy. So re-establishing it at the European level, and certainly around those issues of the semester, would make the process much more inclusive, much more transparent, and in the end, much more accountable and thus democratic. And thank you for raising that question, because it's a question that we very often leave aside, while the nature and the quality of the process is certainly as important as the outputs and the policy itself.
Thank you. I will take this opportunity to ask you one last question, but on the condition that each of you takes at most 1 minute to answer, because we are approaching the end of our session. It's a question by Linda Zailina. Do you see a growing or changing role for the ECB in the future? Is there a scope for it to become more efficient in helping Eurozone countries tackle the issues they face? Please be brief.
Maybe I can start. I think the ECB is definitively playing an important role, maybe a role that is really dominant in the European Euro area macroeconomics. And I would see a stronger role of the national fiscal policies joining together in some kind of form of joint debt and joint guarantees for the debt, so that the role of the ECB can be reduced. I think so far the ECB had to do all the dirty things the national governments didn't want to do, and I think it should be reversed, that the governments take a much stronger role in mutually supporting themselves, so that the role of the ECB would be easier.
Agnès Bénassy-Quéré.
Thank you. So I agree that stronger fiscal policies will make life easier for the ECB, will alleviate the burden on the ECB. So what we are going to face in the future is kind of a trade-off between between different forms of liabilities. So people think you can bury the debts forever in the balance sheet of the ECB, which is true if there is no inflation any longer and no risk on the credibility of monetary policy. So we are going, if we forget for a minute the institutional framework where the ECB is of course independent, you can think of this as a trade-off between debt unsustainability, fiscal unsustainability, and monetary unsustainability or non-credibility. So you move from one to the other, and so far so good. There is no inflationary risk. So we are all happy to move with less debt on the market, more central bank liquidity. But at some point, we need to get ready to go the other way around. So we will be left, in my view, with this trade-off between relying very much on the ECB with the risk. No one can forecast the inflation rate in 20 years. So there may be a risk at some point, especially if the equity becomes negative and with a growing negative number. So at some point, we know that there are other currencies, so there will be private currencies. So we should always keep this in mind, that we should not destroy monetary credibility for the sake of fiscal sustainability. And maybe at some point, some debt restructuring will be needed.
Thank you. Thank you. Paul Magnette?
Well, very short. First, I agree with Agnès and Peter. I think, yes, if there were more political integration and more political coordination, we would need the ECB less. And in this sense, the decision of the German Constitutional Court of Karlsruhe can be read and interpreted as a reminder. I mean, we cannot ask the ECB to do everything, to go beyond what the treaty requires of the ECB. If at some point, I mean, politics have to come back again, and we need to go back to political integration, which also implies, I think, and I come back to that, more accountability. I mean, I know, of course, there is a parliamentary control of the ECB's work in the Economic and Monetary Committee of the EP, but nobody knows about it. So I think we would need more visibility. When the president of the Fed goes to the Congress in the US, it's a big event, and everybody, I mean, and it's a big public debate, and it creates a wide public conversation about the US monetary policy. It's quite rare that we have the same kind of debates about the policy choice of the ECB, and I think it would be great if the EP put more, not just not pressure, but exercise its control fully and created an accountable public arena around the EU's monetary policy.
Thank you very much to our speakers. It's time to round up this first webinar of the two that ETUI and FEPS are hosting today. I would like to again to thank all three speakers and all attendants. And I will finish with two more technical remarks. I would just like to ask the speakers to smile for the digital photo for this webinar.
Smile.
And to ask participants to hang on for another couple of minutes. The next webinar entitled Scenarios for a Post-COVID Society will start in very shortly. Thank you very much for your time and your questions.
Thank you.